The day Henrietta Finley rode into Caldwell, Kansas, on a stolen horse with a bullet hole in her sleeve and a Winchester rifle across her lap, every respectable woman on the main street turned her back, and every man stood a little straighter, unsure whether to tip his hat or reach for his own gun. It was the spring of 1878, and Caldwell was trying very hard to be a proper town. There was a new church with white-painted boards that still smelled of pine sap, a general store run by a man named Elias Prout, who weighed everything twice and charged for the privilege, and a Ladies Temperance Society that met every Thursday afternoon in the back room of the church and produced resolutions that nobody outside that back room ever paid any attention to. The cattle drives were already turning Caldwell into something loud and unpredictable, and the respectable citizens were fighting the noise and the mud and the cowboys with the grim determination of people who believed that civilization was something you built one white picket fence at a time. Henrietta Finley did not own a white picket fence. She owned a reputation, a horse that was not technically hers, and a temper that had been described in 3 different counties as a force of nature. She was 26 years old, brown-haired, brown-eyed, with a jaw that suggested stubbornness and hands that were more accustomed to reins than to embroidery hoops. She wore a man's duster coat over her own dress because it was practical, not because she was making a statement, though it amounted to the same thing wherever she went. She had come to Caldwell because her brother, Thomas, had sent her a letter 3 weeks ago saying he was in trouble and that he needed help, and then had sent no follow-up letter, which was its own kind of message. Thomas was younger than her by 4 years and considerably less careful, and the two of them had been each other's only family since their father had gone out to check the cattle one January night in 1871 and simply never come back, and their mother had followed him into the earth 2 winters after that. Henrietta tied her horse at the rail outside the Silver Crown Saloon, because that was the most logical place to find information about a man who was in trouble, and walked inside without hesitating at the door, which was another thing that caused the respectable women of Caldwell to purse their lips and shake their heads among themselves. The saloon was doing modest afternoon business. A card game occupied one corner table. 2 cowboys leaned against the bar, drinking in the methodical way of men who had been thirsty for a long time. Behind the bar stood a round-faced man with very small hands who looked up at Henrietta with the particular expression of someone who has seen everything and is still capable of being mildly surprised. She laid her rifle on the bar top, not threateningly, but the way a person sets down a tool they are carrying, and said, "I am looking for Thomas Finley. He is about 22 years old, dark hair like mine, has a scar on his chin from a fence post. He would have come through here sometime in the last month." The bartender's name was Gus Melville, and he had a gift for reading rooms, which had kept him healthy in his profession. He looked at the rifle, looked at the woman behind it, and made a series of rapid calculations. "You his sister?" he asked. "I am," Henrietta said. "He's alive," Gus said, which told her that the question of whether he was alive had been a real one worth addressing. "He's in the rooms above the doctor's office. Doc Carver's been keeping him. Got himself shot in the left shoulder about 3 weeks ago." Henrietta closed her eyes for just one moment. Then she opened them, picked up her rifle, and said, "Thank you," with the kind of courtesy that comes from genuine relief rather than habit. She was almost to the door when a voice from the corner said, "You might want to know who shot him before you go charging over there." She stopped. She turned. The man at the corner table had pushed his chair back slightly. He was not playing cards. He had been sitting alone with a cup of coffee, which was an unusual thing to be drinking in a saloon in the afternoon. He was perhaps 29 or 30, broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who had done heavy work for most of his adult life, with dark blonde hair that needed cutting and a face that was weathered but not unkind. He wore a badge on his coat. It was the star-shaped kind that meant county sheriff, not the cheaper circular deputy's badge. His name, though Henrietta did not yet know it, was Patrick Hadley. "Who are you?" she said, because she had never learned the skill of being indirect. "Sheriff of Sumner County," he said, without any particular pride in it, the way a man states a fact that is simply true. "Patrick Hadley. And you are Henrietta Finley, which I know because your brother talked about you the whole first day I sat with him while Doc Carver was deciding whether to take the shoulder or leave it." "He kept the shoulder," Henrietta said. "He did," Patrick said. "Your brother is going to be fine. Sore for a good while and foolish probably forever, but fine. Come sit down for a minute and let me tell you what happened, because walking into the situation without knowing it is a good way to make it worse." She considered him for a moment. She was not accustomed to being invited to sit down by men she did not know. She was accustomed to being looked at sideways or talked over or told politely that she would be more comfortable waiting somewhere else. This man was doing none of those things. He was simply waiting, as if her sitting down or not sitting down was entirely her decision, and he had no stake in the outcome either way. She sat down. "Your brother came to Caldwell following a man named Deke Sorrells," Patrick said. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and leaned forward slightly. "Sorrells runs a land scheme out of this county. He has been selling parcels of land to settlers that he does not own, collecting the payment, and then having the actual owners run the settlers off. Your brother purchased a parcel about 2 months ago, everything he had. When he figured out what had happened and came looking for answers, Sorrells had him shot." Henrietta said nothing for a moment. The sounds of the saloon continued around them, the low conversation, the scrape of boots on floorboards, the distant sound of a horse on the street outside. "Is Sorrells still in this county?" she said. "He is," Patrick said. "And that is the problem. He has enough money to have made friends in enough places that arresting him has been what I would describe as complicated." "By complicated you mean someone is protecting him?" "By complicated I mean the county judge has twice refused warrants, and the territorial marshal has not answered my last 2 letters, Patrick said, and the flatness in his voice told her that this was a frustration he had been carrying for some time. "Which means I am building a legal case by collecting statements and evidence the hard way, and I need time I might not have, because Sorrells knows I am doing it and is not a patient man." "How many people has he done this to?" Henrietta asked. "Besides my brother?" "7 families that I know of," Patrick said. 4 of them have already left the territory. 1 family, the Beckers, are still trying to hold their land 20 miles east of here. August Becker refuses to leave. He has a wife and 4 children. Henrietta leaned back in her chair. She had a particular way of being still that was not passive but rather the opposite. It was the stillness of a person doing a great deal of thinking very fast. Patrick watched her and did not try to fill the silence. "What do you need from me?" she said finally. He looked at her with something that might have been surprise. "I did not say I needed anything from you," he said. "I said I thought you should know the situation before you went to your brother." "You told me all of that for a reason," she said. "You would not have called me over here just to explain the situation and then send me off. What do you need?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, without any of the excessive politeness that men often used with women as a form of condescension, he said, "Your brother saw Sorrells sign a document 3 weeks ago, the day before he was shot. He told me what was in it. It was a deed transfer, a fraudulent one. And if I could find that document, I would have what I need to bring this to a territorial judge in Wichita rather than the local one. But Sorrells keeps his documents at his house rather than in a bank or a lawyer's office, because he does not trust anybody who can read well." "Where is his house?" Henrietta said. "I'm not asking you to break into a man's house," Patrick said quickly, and he said it in the voice of a man who has principles and knows where they are. "That is not what I am suggesting." "I did not ask what you were suggesting," Henrietta said. "I asked where his house is." Patrick Hadley looked at her for a long moment, and then, very slowly, something that was not quite a smile crossed his face. It was more complex than a smile, it was recognition, the expression of a person who has unexpectedly encountered something they were not looking for but now cannot quite look away from. "You are not what I expected," he said. "People rarely expect me," Henrietta said. "Where is his house?" She went to see Thomas first, because that was the right thing to do, and she was capable of doing the right thing even when she was also planning to do the complicated thing. Doc Carver's office was on the quiet side of Main Street, a small wooden building with a window box that held some determined brown weeds that had once been flowers. Doc Carver himself was a thin man of about 60, with the careful eyes of someone who had sewn up more wounds than he could count, and had made his peace with human fragility without becoming indifferent to it. Thomas was in a cot near the window, his left arm in a sling, his color better than she had feared, but his expression when she walked in and he saw her face, that of a man who understood he was about to receive a reckoning. "Henny," he said, which was what he had called her since he was 4 years old and could not manage the full name. "Thomas," she said, and pulled a chair to his bedside and sat in it. She looked at the sling. She looked at his face. She reached out and put her hand over his right hand, which was the uninjured one, and held it for a moment. Then she said, "Tell me everything." He told her everything. It matched what Patrick Hadley had said, which meant that Patrick Hadley had been telling her the truth and not a managed version of it, which she noted. Thomas had bought the land parcel with money he had saved for 3 years, working cattle drives and harvest crews and any other work he could find. He had believed in it completely. He had ridden out to see it, and it was beautiful, he said, a stretch of grass near a creek that ran clear even in dry months, and he had stood on it and felt, for the first time in his adult life, like he was standing on something solid that was his. And then Sorrel's men had come, and then the actual landowner, a rancher named Caldwell who was in Sorrel's pocket, had shown the territorial papers, and Thomas had understood what had happened. He had come to Caldwell to confront Sorrel's, and the confrontation had ended with a rifle shot at 40 yards and a month spent healing in a borrowed cot. "I should have known better," Thomas said. "Yes," Henrietta said, because she loved him too much to tell him comfortable lies, but she said it gently. "But you did not, and now we are here, and now we will fix it." "Henny, you should not." "Thomas," she said, "I love you very much. Please be quiet and rest." She went back to the saloon that evening, which further damaged her standing with the Ladies Temperance Society, though she was not aware of this and would not have cared. Patrick Hadley was still there, now with a plate of food that he was eating with the systematic attention of a man who has learned not to take regular meals for granted. She sat across from him without being invited, which was the only way she ever sat anywhere. "I am going to Sorrel's house," she said, "not to steal anything. I want to look at it. I want to know what we are working with." Patrick set down his fork. "I told you that was not what I was suggesting." "And I told you I was not asking what you were suggesting," Henrietta said. "But I will also tell you that I am not reckless. I was raised on a ranch. I know how to read land, and I know how to be quiet when I need to be. And I know that you need that document and that you have not been able to get it yourself because you are the county sheriff and cannot be seen doing what needs to be done to get it." He looked at her for a long time. She met his gaze without any of the evasiveness that people sometimes use to make powerful men comfortable. "You are the most direct person I have met in this county," he said finally. "Is that a problem?" she said. "No," he said slowly. "It is not." He picked up his fork again and then set it back down. "His house is 4 miles east of town on the road that forks toward the Becker place. It is a stone house which he built to look substantial with a bunkhouse for his men. He usually has 2 men on the property at night. The documents your brother described a green metal box, the kind you can get at any hardware store, kept in the main room on a shelf behind the desk." Henrietta nodded. "Thank you," she said. "I did not tell you that," Patrick said. "No," she agreed. "You did not." She waited 2 more days. She used those 2 days purposefully. She spoke to Thomas at length, extracting every detail he could remember about the layout of the house, the hours of Sorrel's schedule, the habits of his men. She rode the road east of town twice, in daylight, as casually as someone might ride for the exercise of it, and she looked at the land the way her father had taught her to look at land, not just at what was there, but at what the terrain told you about movement and sight lines and cover. During those 2 days she also, somewhat to her own surprise, found herself in Patrick Hadley's company more than she expected. It was not deliberate on either side, or at least it did not begin as deliberate. Caldwell was not a large town. The places where one might eat or drink or sit in relative comfort were limited. She encountered him at Gus Melville's saloon, and at the counter of the general store where Elias Prout weighed things twice, and once on the street outside Doc Carver's office when they both arrived to check on Thomas at the same time, and stood for a moment in the doorway sorting out who would go first. He was not like other men she had known, which was a category that included her father, her brother, the ranchers and cowboys she had grown up around, and the various men over the years who had decided that her directness was something they wanted to argue with until it softened. Patrick Hadley did not seem to find her directness uncomfortable. He responded to it directly, as if it were simply the most efficient way to have a conversation, which in her experience it was. He had opinions and he stated them, and when she disagreed with him, which happened on the subject of the territorial government, and on the subject of whether August Becker should be trying to hold his land, he listened to her counterargument with genuine attention rather than the performance of patience. He was also, she noticed with the clarity of someone who had not allowed herself to notice such things in quite some time, a man who was easy to look at. Not in the showy way of men who knew it and traded on it, but in the quieter way of someone whose face had been made honest by experience. "You grew up on a ranch?" he asked her the second afternoon, when they had both ended up at the same corner of the saloon in the late afternoon light that came through the western window. "Outside of Abilene," she said. "My father had cattle, not many but enough. He taught me everything practical that he knew, which included the rifle and the horse and how to read weather." "And your mother," he said. "She taught me to read books and to do accounts," Henrietta said. "She was a school teacher before she married. She believed education was the thing that could not be taken from you." "She was right," Patrick said. "She was right about most things," Henrietta said, and the simplicity of grief in her voice was so undefended that Patrick looked at her differently for a moment, not with pity but with the recognition of someone who understood that kind of loss. "My father died in '73, he said, not offering more than that, letting the shared geography of loss speak for itself. "I am sorry," she said, and she meant it in the simple, direct way she meant everything. There was a silence between them that was not uncomfortable but rather the opposite, the kind of silence that happens between two people who have talked enough that they no longer need to fill every moment but have not yet talked enough to know what the silence means. "Where did you come from before this?" she asked. "Before Sumner County." "Dodge City for a while," he said. "Before that, Missouri. I came west because I thought the law meant something here, that it was newer and cleaner out here than it was back east, which was naive." "It was," she agreed. "It is still worth fighting for," he said, and he said it quietly, not as an argument but as a belief, the kind you hold on to because letting go of it would make the work impossible. She looked at him. He was looking at the window, at the late afternoon street, and she had the thought clear and sudden and somewhat inconvenient, that she had not wanted to be in the same room as someone the way she wanted to be in the same room as Patrick Hadley in quite a long time. She did not do anything with this thought. She filed it in the part of her mind labeled things to consider later and returned her attention to the immediate problem. On the third night, she went to Sorrel's house. She left her horse a quarter-mile back, tied at a creek crossing where the sound of the water would cover any sound, and went the rest of the way on foot through the grass, moving with the patience her father had taught her. There was a half-moon, which gave enough light to navigate and not enough to be easily seen. She wore dark clothing and left the rifle with the horse, carrying instead the smaller pistol she kept at her hip. She had been right about the two men. One was on the front of the property, and one was at the bunkhouse, which meant the back of the stone house was unguarded. She watched for 20 minutes before she moved, counting their patterns and distances the way you count cattle in a field steadily, without rushing. The back window was not locked. This was not surprising. Sorrells was the kind of man who believed his reputation and his hired men were sufficient protection. She was inside in less than a minute. The house smelled of tobacco and money, which was a specific combination cedar and leather, and the slightly sour scent of a place that is furnished for impression rather than comfort. The main room was exactly as Thomas had described it. The desk sat against the far wall, and behind it was the shelf, and on the shelf, third from the left among a row of ledgers, was the green metal box. She did not open it. She was not there to steal. She was there, as she had told Patrick, to see what they were working with. She looked at the box. She looked at the shelf. She looked at the desk, and by the light of the moon through the front window she could see the surface of it, not orderly but not chaotic, the papers of a man who worked through things in his own system. She had been about to leave when she heard Sorrells himself come in through the front door. She moved without thinking, back into the shadows of the corridor that led to the sleeping rooms, and stood absolutely still against the wall. Sorrells was not alone. He was with another man whose voice she did not recognize, and they were talking about the Becker property. "Becker's not moving," Sorrells said. He had a voice like gravel on dry wood. "Send Carson out there tomorrow to remind him what the terms are." "And if he still won't move," the other man said. "Then he gets reminded harder," Sorrells said. "I have a buyer for that land coming in from Kansas City in 2 weeks. I need Becker gone." She stood in the dark corridor and breathed steadily and did not move, and Sorrells poured himself a drink and sat at his desk for nearly half an hour going through papers, while she stood in the dark and waited. And then he went to his sleeping room, which was fortunately in the other direction, and she waited another 15 minutes until she heard his breathing change through the thin wall, and then she went back out through the window and across the dark grass and back to her horse. She rode back to town, and instead of going to her room above the boarding house run by a Mrs. Alma Garfield, who had already expressed private reservations about her to 3 separate neighbors, she went to the saloon because she knew Patrick would be there. He was the last kind of lawman, the kind who slept badly when things were unresolved, and the things in his county were deeply unresolved. He was at his corner table. He had not been drinking, but he had the look of a man who had been thinking hard. She sat down. "The Beckers," she said. He straightened slightly. "What about them?" "Sorrells is sending men to them tomorrow. He has a buyer coming in 2 weeks. He needs them gone." She told him what she had heard, quickly and completely, and watched his face process it. "You were inside the house," he said, and his voice was not accusatory but rather flat, with something between alarm and what she suspected, in a man less controlled, would have been fear for her. "I was," she said. "The box is there. 3rd shelf from the left, behind the desk. If you could get a warrant." "The local judge will not give me a warrant," Patrick said, and the frustration in his voice was old and familiar. "I have told you that." "Then go around him," she said. "You said the territorial judge in Wichita. I need more than I have to make that case. If I bring a half-built case to Wichita and it falls apart, Sorrells walks free, and I lose the ability to come back at him." "Then we get you more," Henrietta said. "The Beckers are witnesses. They have lived through what he has done. Go to them, get their statements in writing. Then go to the families who left. Where did they go?" "Most of them settled near Wichita," Patrick said. "Then write to them," she said. "Get written statements. Thomas can give a formal statement now that he is well enough to hold a pen. You put together everything you have and you go to Wichita yourself, and you do not wait for the territorial marshal to answer your letters." Patrick was quiet for a moment. He was looking at her with that same expression she had first noticed, not quite a smile, something more complex than a smile. "You think about things very practically," he said. "I think about things the way they need to be thought about," she said. "Most people in your position would have left," he said. "You found your brother alive. The reasonable thing to do would be to take him and go." "I am aware of what the reasonable thing would be," Henrietta said. "Why are you not doing it?" he asked. The question was direct, the way his questions tended to be, but it carried a weight beneath it that was not just about Sorrels or the Beckers or the land scheme. It was about her specifically, and she knew it, and he knew she knew it. She considered the question honestly. "Because it would not be finished," she said finally, "and I do not leave things unfinished." He nodded slowly. "Nor do I," he said, and something passed between them in that moment that was quieter than words and more significant, the recognition of a fundamental similarity that neither of them had expected to find. The next morning, before Sorrel's man Carson could ride out to the Becker property, Patrick Hadley rode out himself and arrived first. Henrietta rode with him, because she had insisted and he had not argued, perhaps because he had learned already that arguing with her was a complicated exercise, or perhaps for a different reason that he was not yet examining closely. The Becker place was a modest homestead, a wooden house and a small barn, set in the middle of land that was visibly good land. The creek Thomas had described ran nearby, and the grass was thick and green in the May morning, and August Becker's 4 children were visible in the yard, which made the whole situation more immediate and more painful in the specific way that it always is when children are involved. August Becker was a square-built man of about 40, with the deliberate movements of someone who had come through difficult things and kept going. His wife, Clara, was a small, precise woman who looked at Henrietta with something that was not quite wariness but was its own version of assessment, and then, apparently satisfied with what she found, offered her coffee. "Sorrels is sending a man today," Patrick told August, and told him what Henrietta had overheard, and August Becker's jaw tightened and he looked at his land the way a man looks at something he has built himself from very little. "I am not leaving," August said. "I know you are not," Patrick said. "I am not here to tell you to leave. I am here to ask you to give me a written statement. Everything Sorrels has done to you, every interaction, every threat, everything you have witnessed. Will you do that?" August looked at Clara. Clara looked at him and gave a small, definitive nod. "Yes," August said, "we will do that." They spent 2 hours at the Becker kitchen table. Clara brought out a school writing pad and a good pen and wrote in a clear hand as August spoke and Patrick and Henrietta asked questions and filled in details. The children moved in and out of the doorway, curious and quiet. The youngest, a boy of about 4, ended up sitting on the floor near Henrietta's feet, apparently deciding she was an acceptable presence, and she looked down at him once, and he looked up at her with the absolute calm of very small children who have not yet learned to be intimidated by unfamiliar people. Sorrel's man Carson arrived in the early afternoon. He was a lean man on a gray horse who pulled up at the edge of the Becker property and took in the sight of the county sheriff's horse at the hitching post and the sheriff himself standing in the doorway with the unhurried posture of someone who has all day and is not moving. Carson turned his horse around and rode back the way he had come. August Becker watched him go. Then he turned to Patrick and said, "That buys us today." "It buys us some time," Patrick said. "I am going to Wichita as soon as I have what I need." Henrietta said, "Go in the next 3 days, before Sorrel's buyer arrives. Because once a buyer from Kansas City is in the picture, there will be more money involved and more pressure, and it will be harder." Both men looked at her. She met both their gazes without apology. "She is right," August said simply. Patrick gathered the rest of what he needed over the following 2 days. He wrote letters and received one back from the family in Wichita who had been swindled, the Hendersons, who sent their own handwritten account that arrived by the eastbound rider on the second afternoon. Thomas gave his formal statement from his cot at Doc Carver's, written in his own unsteady left-hand printing, because the right-arm movement still pulled at his shoulder, and signed it with the careful deliberateness of someone doing something that matters. During those 2 days, Henrietta helped. She organized the documents, because she had her mother's gift for accounts and order, and the sheaf of evidence that had been a disorganized and demoralizing collection of scraps became, under her hands, a structured and legible argument. She wrote a summary page in the clear, precise hand her mother had taught her, which laid out the pattern of Sorrel's scheme in the logical sequence of a case, not just a complaint. Patrick came into the room at the boarding house, where she had laid everything out on the small table, and stood looking at what she had done. The late afternoon light was coming through the window, and it lay across the papers and across her bent head because she was still working, adjusting something in the sequence. "Henrietta," he said. She looked up. He stopped. He picked up the summary page and read through it. She watched him read it. There was something about watching him read her work that made her feel exposed in a way that had nothing to do with vulnerability, and everything to do with the specific exposure of being seen clearly by someone whose intelligence you respect. "This is good," he said. He said it simply, without the excessive qualifier or the slightly surprised tone that men sometimes used when acknowledging the competence of women. He said it the way he would say anything that was simply true. "This is very good. The territorial judge will not be able to dismiss this." "No," she said. "He will not." He set the page down. He was standing close, the small table between them, and the afternoon was quiet in the particular way Caldwell was quiet at this hour, before the evening trade of the saloon picked up and the town changed its character. "I am going to Wichita the day after tomorrow," he said. "I want you to know that you have—" He stopped again. "What you have done here matters," he said. "It matters to the Beckers, it matters to your brother, it matters to all of them." "It matters to me," she said, "not as a favor to anyone. It matters because it is wrong and because something should be done about it." "Yes," he said, and the simplicity of his agreement was more affecting than an elaborate speech would have been. There was a moment, the kind of moment that has its own weather. She was aware of how close he was standing, and she was aware that she was aware of it, which was information about herself that she did not immediately know what to do with. "Patrick," she said, and his name in her mouth was the first time she had used it directly without the formal title, and it landed between them with a small, specific weight. He looked at her with those steady, direct eyes. "Nothing," she said, because what she had been about to say was something she had not yet decided to say, and she was nothing if not deliberate. He nodded as if this made complete sense, which, given the kind of person he was, perhaps it did. The evening before he left for Wichita, they sat together on the front step of the boarding house long after Mrs. Alma Garfield had retired and the saloon had quieted. This was the kind of behavior that would be discussed at the next meeting of the Ladies Temperance Society, but neither of them was giving it any thought. The night was warm and smelled of grass and the distant moisture of the creek, and the stars over the Kansas plain were the kind of stars you could not get in any city, thick and close and unglamorous in their abundance. She asked him why he had stayed in Sumner County when the county judge was corrupt and the territorial marshal was unresponsive, and the whole enterprise of law enforcement must sometimes feel like trying to build a wall with sand. He thought about this for a long time before he answered. She appreciated that, the thinking before answering, rather than the quick response that was really just the first thing that came. "Because the people who stay in a place make the place what it is," he said. "The Beckers stayed. Your brother came here for something real. Most of the people in this county are trying to build something that is theirs. If the people who are supposed to keep the law leave every time the law is hard to keep, then what is left is Sorrel's. And I will not leave this county to Sorrel's." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "That is the best reason for doing anything I have heard in several years." He turned his head to look at her. They were close enough on the narrow step that she could see the detail of his face clearly, even in the starlight. His expression was one she had not seen him wear before, not the considering look he wore when he was working through a problem, and not the flat, professional look he wore when he was executing his authority. This was something more personal and less controlled. "Henrietta," he said. "Yes," she said. "I want to say something," he said, "and I would like to say it correctly, which means I need a moment." She said nothing. She gave him the moment. "Since you came into this town," he said slowly, "you have been the most, you are the most—" He stopped. He tried again. "You ride into Caldwell on a stolen horse with a bullet hole in your sleeve, and within 3 days you have organized the evidence for a case I have been building for 4 months and gone inside Sorrel's house in the dark without flinching. And you argue with me, and you are almost always right when you do. And you looked at August Becker's smallest child like a person who understands that children are worth protecting. And He stopped again. His jaw tightened slightly. "Patrick," she said, "you are a man who is usually direct. Be direct." He looked at her. Then he said, "I do not want to go to Wichita without telling you that I find myself considerably less indifferent to whether you are in the same town as me than I would have predicted 3 days ago." It was not a poem. It was not the kind of speech that women in novels received. It was, instead, the kind of honest, imperfect declaration that comes from a person who means every word of it and cannot dress it in anything that would make it sound less true. She sat with it for a moment. She felt something in her chest that she recognized and had not felt in a very long time, something warm and specific. Not general happiness, but the particular warmth of feeling genuinely known. "I find the same thing to be true," she said, "which is an inconvenient discovery given that I had not planned to stay in Caldwell and you are about to leave for Wichita." "I will be back in a week," he said. "I know you will," she said. Another silence, a good one. "There is something else," he said. "What?" "The Ladies Temperance Society," he said, with a completely straight face, "has apparently sent a delegation to Mrs. Garfield to express their concerns about your presence in Caldwell." She stared at him. Then she said, "What concerns?" "You rode in on a stolen horse. You went into a saloon alone and set a rifle on the bar. You have been seen in my company at unsuitable hours. You wore a man's duster coat on Main Street." He was still keeping his face completely straight, but there was something working at the corner of his mouth. "They have formally declared you too fierce for polite company." She looked at him. Then she began to laugh. Not the polite, controlled laughter that she had seen women perform at appropriate moments, but actual laughter, the surprised, genuine kind that came from a real place. He watched her laugh, and the something working at the corner of his mouth became a full, unguarded smile. And she thought that it was probably the best thing she had seen in Caldwell so far. "Too fierce for polite company," she said when she had recovered herself. "Is that what they said?" "Word for word," he said, "as reported to me by Gus Melville, who finds the whole situation very entertaining." "And what do you think?" she said. He looked at her in the starlight with that open, unguarded expression that was so much more arresting than his professional face. "I think," he said, "that I have never wanted polite company. I wanted her." He said it simply. He said her, meaning her specifically, Henrietta Finley, sitting on a boarding house step in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1878, with the stars overhead and the sound of a distant coyote somewhere to the east. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she said, "That is either the most sensible thing you have said to me or the most foolish." "Quite possibly both," he said. "Quite possibly," she agreed. She reached out and put her hand over his where it rested on the step between them, and he turned his hand and held hers, and they sat like that for a while in the warm spring night without needing to say anything else at all. He left for Wichita the next morning at first light. She stood on the street and watched him go, which was something she did not generally do for anyone, but which felt, this time, like the most natural thing in the world. He turned in the saddle when he was 20 yards out and looked back at her, and she looked back at him, and that was sufficient. She spent the week of his absence productively. She sat with Thomas every day and watched him grow stronger and more restless, which were the good signs after injury. She helped Mrs. Garfield with the garden, not out of any particular enthusiasm for gardening, but because it was useful, and Mrs. Garfield had softened toward her after a conversation in which Henrietta had told her, with complete directness, that she understood the concerns and found them reasonable and did not intend to cause any trouble for the boarding house. Mrs. Garfield, who had expected either an argument or an apology and received neither, had paused and then said, "Well, the east corner beds need weeding if you want something to do." And Henrietta had spent a productive 2 hours in the dirt, and they had gotten along reasonably well since. She also went twice more to the Becker property, not because anything was required of her, but because she had told Clara Becker she would check in, and because August Becker was one of those people whose steadiness made you want to prove yourself worth it. She brought supplies from Elias Prute's general store, both times flour and sugar, and a length of good calico cloth, paid for from her own money, which was limited but present. On the second visit, Clara Becker said to her, while the men were outside and the children were occupied and they were alone in the kitchen, "You love him, don't you? The sheriff?" Henrietta did not pretend to misunderstand. She also did not immediately agree because she was not in the habit of saying things she was not certain of. She thought about it genuinely and quickly. "I think I am arriving at that conclusion," she said. Clara smiled. It was a small, knowing smile. "He is a good man," she said. "There are not as many good men as there should be. When you find one, it is worth knowing it." "I know it," Henrietta said. Patrick came back on the 7th day. He rode into Caldwell in the late afternoon with the specific quality of tired that comes from a long ride at speed, which told her that he had pushed the horse on the return. She was sitting on the boarding house step with a book when she heard the hoofbeats on Main Street, and she looked up, and she put the book down and she walked to the street. He dismounted at the rail and led his horse to water and then turned around, and there she was, standing on the boardwalk in the afternoon light, and his face, which was tired and dusty from the road, did something complicated and warm and unguarded when he saw her. "Well," she said. "Territorial Judge Harlow issued a warrant," he said, "and the Territorial Marshal is riding from Wichita with 2 deputies and will arrive the day after tomorrow to execute it. The warrant covers Sorrel's property, specifically including the document box." He paused. "Your summary was read aloud at the hearing. Harlow said it was the clearest presentation of a land fraud case he had seen in 5 years. She breathed out slowly. "Good," she said. "Good," he agreed. Then he stepped up onto the boardwalk, and he was close, and he smelled of road dust and horse and something warm underneath, and he looked at her for a moment and said, "I thought about you the whole road back." "That must have made the road seem shorter," she said. "Considerably," he said. She tilted her face up toward his, and he kissed her, there on the Main Street boardwalk of Caldwell, Kansas, in the full sight of anyone who happened to be looking, which included Gus Melville in the saloon doorway across the street, who had the decency to pretend he was looking at something else entirely, and the Ladies Temperance Society representative Mrs. Hargrove, who was coming out of the general store and stopped short, and then thought better of whatever she had been about to say and kept walking. The kiss was unhurried and direct, like everything about both of them, and when they stepped back from each other they were both smiling. "I should see to my horse," he said. "You should," she agreed. The Territorial Marshal arrived 2 days later as promised, a broad, weathered man named Forrest Cole, who had the look of someone who had been executing warrants since before Sorrels was born, and found the whole business straightforward and a little tedious. He rode out to Sorrel's house with his 2 deputies and Patrick, and Henrietta did not go, because Patrick had asked her not to, not because she could not take care of herself, but because a civilian at a warrant execution complicated the legal standing of the operation, and she understood the reasoning and agreed with it. She waited. She sat with Thomas, who was sitting up now and had progressed to being frustrated about his convalescence, and played cards with him, badly enough that he won several hands in a row, which improved his mood considerably. Patrick came back in the late afternoon. He came to Doc Carver's first, which she thought later was its own kind of answer about his priorities. He stood in the doorway of the room where she and Thomas were playing cards, and he said, "The warrant was executed. The box was on the shelf where you said it would be. The deed transfer document was inside it, along with 3 others that we did not know existed that implicate the county judge in the scheme." He paused. "Sorrels is in custody. The county judge will follow. The territorial marshal is taking them both to Wichita." Thomas said something that would have embarrassed their mother. Henrietta said, "And the Becker land?" "The fraudulent deed transfer is void," Patrick said. "The Beckers keep their land. So does every other family that can be found. The Hendersons in Wichita will have their money returned from Sorrel's assets." He came into the room and sat in the chair at Thomas's bedside, the one Henrietta had been using, and she leaned against the wall, and Thomas looked between them with the expression of a man who has been in a sick room long enough to notice things that might otherwise be beneath his attention. "You got all of them," Thomas said. "We got all of them," Patrick said, and the "we" was particular and deliberate. Thomas looked at Henrietta. "I take it back," he said. "What do you take back?" she said. "Everything I ever said about you being too much," he said, "which I have said, as you know, on approximately 17 separate occasions." 19, she said. 19, he agreed. "I take all of it back." The celebration in Caldwell that evening was modest because Caldwell was a modest town trying very hard. But Gus Melville put out a bottle of his good whiskey, and there was general warmth at the Silver Crown. And August Becker rode in from his property to shake Patrick's hand and Henrietta's, and his handshake for her was as firm as the one he gave Patrick, which she appreciated. The thing that happened next happened gradually, the way things that are actually meant to happen do, not all at once in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of days, each one building on the last. Patrick did not ask her to stay in Caldwell in a direct way at first. But he did things that made staying in Caldwell increasingly sensible. He introduced her to people. He mentioned her, in conversation with county officials and businessmen, in the casual tone of someone referencing a person who is simply a part of the landscape. He brought her problems that he was working through and asked her opinion, and her opinion was consistently useful, which meant he kept asking, which meant they kept talking. Thomas recovered fully. By June he could ride, which he did with excessive enthusiasm the first day he was allowed to, galloping up and down the creek road until his shoulder reminded him of its limits, and he came back to town at a more dignified pace. He was healthy and restless, and starting to look at the Kansas territory with the same hopeful hunger he had felt before Sorrel's had taken his land and his money and his confidence. "There is good land available 40 miles west," Patrick told him one evening when they were all three at the saloon. "The land office in Wichita has homestead claims open. With the swindle documented, your name carries weight. Any judge would look favorably on your application." Thomas looked at Henrietta. She looked at him. "Are you planning to stay here?" he asked her, and in the careful way he said here it was clear that he meant Caldwell specifically and Patrick more specifically. "I am considering it," she said. "Well," Thomas said, "I suppose someone has to civilize this town." "I am not going to civilize it," she said. "I am going to live in it." Gus Melville, who was within hearing distance, raised his glass at this, apparently finding it the most reasonable thing said in his establishment in recent memory. Thomas filed his homestead claim in July. He got the land, 43 miles west, a good parcel near water, and he rode out to it on a hot July morning with a cartload of supplies and the expression of a man who has been given a second chance and knows exactly what it cost and intends to make it worth the price. Henrietta rode with him the first part of the way, and they said goodbye at the fork in the road that went west, and she hugged him, which they did not do often because they were both private people, and he held on for a moment longer than expected. "You are happy," he said, with some surprise, as if he had been waiting to verify it. "I am becoming happy," she said, which was more accurate and which he accepted as the careful, honest person he was when the situation called for it. She went back to Caldwell. Patrick was waiting at the end of Main Street, leaning against the hitching post with his hat pushed back and his face turned up to the summer sky, and when he heard her horse he straightened and looked at her, and the warmth in his face when he looked at her was the specific warmth of someone who has been waiting and is glad the waiting is over. "He got off all right," Patrick said. "He is going to be fine," she said. He helped her down from her horse without making a performance of it, just the practical courtesy of a man who has noticed that the dismount from a long ride is easier with a hand offered, and when her feet were on the ground she was standing very close to him and neither of them stepped back. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask," she said. He had clearly been thinking about how to say it, because he said it with the slight deliberateness of someone who has considered the words. "I know that you have not planned your life around Caldwell or around me," he said. "And I know that you are not the kind of person who can be asked to give up her own direction. I am not asking that. But I would like to know if your direction, for the foreseeable future, is one that might be compatible with this direction." He gestured, meaning Caldwell, meaning his work, meaning himself. She looked at him for a long moment. The summer afternoon was all around them, the heat, the dust, the sound of the town. A child ran across the street somewhere behind her. A horse snorted at the rail further along. All the ordinary sounds of an ordinary day in a place she had not planned to stay. "I think you are trying to ask me to stay," she said. "I am," he said. "Then ask me directly," she said. He met her eyes. "Stay," he said. "Stay in Caldwell, stay with me. However that looks, whatever arrangement is proper and sensible and right for you, just stay." She said, "Yes." It was, for Henrietta Finley, as elaborate a statement as any she had made in her 26 years, and Patrick Hadley received it as the complete and serious thing it was. They did not rush. They were both, at their core, people who understood that things built carefully were the things that lasted. Over the summer, she settled into Caldwell with the practicality of someone who approaches a new territory the way she would approach new land, by learning it, by finding where she fit in it, and by not pretending to fit where she did not. She discovered, through necessity, that Caldwell needed a notary and document writer badly enough that Elias Prout was willing to let her use the back corner of his general store, and she set up a modest practice of writing contracts and letters and accounts for people who needed things written down correctly and had no reliable source for this. Her mother's education, the one that could not be taken from you, turned out to be precisely what a frontier county needed, and she was busy within the month. She also found, to her own surprise, that she had opinions about Caldwell's future that were not simply theoretical. She attended a town meeting in August uninvited, because she had not been on the notification list, but she went in when she heard it was happening and sat in the back row and said nothing, until someone said something incorrect about the management of the road maintenance budget, at which point she said something correct, and then they were debating. And at the end of the meeting she had been asked to serve on the Town Improvements Committee, which was not something the Ladies Temperance Society had anticipated. Mrs. Hargrove, who was the most formidable member of the Temperance Society, encountered Henrietta outside the church 3 Sundays running and maintained a cautious distance. On the 4th Sunday she sat in the same pew and after the service said without preamble, "You organized that road budget argument correctly." "Thank you," Henrietta said. "I opposed the original budget myself," Mrs. Hargrove said. 3 years ago, nobody listened." "They will listen now," Henrietta said. "The committee can require the accounting." Mrs. Hargrove looked at her with a complicated expression. "You are not what I expected," she said, which was the same thing Patrick had said, and Henrietta received it with the same equanimity. "People rarely expect me," she said. She and Patrick were not rushed about the formal matter of marriage, but it arrived with the inevitability of something that was always the next logical step. He asked her on a September evening, at the same spot on the boarding house step where they had first talked properly, which she recognized as deliberate and appreciated. He had a ring that had been his mother's, a simple gold band with a small garnet that was not flashy but was real and good, and he held it in his hand and said, "I would like to spend the rest of my life with the most direct person I have ever met, if she is willing." She took the ring from his hand and slid it onto her own finger and said, "She is willing." They were married in October of 1878, in the white-painted church that still smelled of pine sap, by a minister named Reverend Shaw, who had baptized 4 children that year, and married 2 couples and buried 1 old rancher, and regarded the whole arc of frontier life with gentle optimism. Patrick stood at the front of the church in a dark coat that was his best and only good coat, and Henrietta walked down the aisle in the dress she had made from a length of deep blue cotton she had bought from Elias Prout, who had charged her his regular price, and not a penny less, but had wrapped the package with a piece of brown paper and a tied string with the particular care of someone doing something meaningful. Doc Carver attended, occupying half a pew with the benign satisfaction of a man who had played his small part in the story by keeping Thomas Finley's shoulder intact. Gus Melville attended in a clean shirt that appeared to be his first clean shirt in recent memory. August and Clara Becker rode in from their property with all 4 children, including the smallest one, who sat in the pew with the same absolute calm with which he had sat on the floor near Henrietta's feet, and recognized her immediately, and climbed into her lap during the part before the service started, which made Patrick, watching from the front of the church, have an expression on his face that he did not entirely manage to contain. Mrs. Hargrove attended and sat in the second pew on the right and sang the hymn louder than anyone else, which was her own form of endorsement. Thomas rode the 43 miles from his homestead for the occasion, arriving the day before with trail dust on his coat and the healthy color of a man who has been working outdoors, and he walked his sister down the aisle because he was the only family she had, and she was the only family he had, and he did it with the pride of someone who knows the value of the thing he is part of. When Reverend Shaw asked if anyone had objections, there was the kind of silence that is not hesitation, but rather the whole room deciding at once that it does not. Patrick said his vows in the direct, unhurried way he said everything that mattered. Henrietta said hers clearly and without trembling, which was not because she was not moved, but because she was the kind of moved that goes down rather than up, that settles rather than shakes. He kissed her as her husband in front of the white-painted church and the entire assembled community of Caldwell, and there was a cheer from the saloon contingent that drowned out the more decorous applause from the church contingent, and somewhere above it all there was the clear Kansas autumn sky, that particular color of blue that has no counterpart in the East. They moved into the house that Patrick had been renting on the eastern edge of town, a solid enough frame house with 2 rooms and a kitchen, and a porch that faced the open land, which Henrietta immediately decided needed a real garden in the spring, having discovered during her time helping Mrs. Garfield's beds that she had, despite her own expectations, an interest in growing things. She began making notes about what she would plant in a small book she kept on the kitchen table, alongside her notary appointment log and her committee records, so that her domestic plans and her professional ones occupied the same organized space. Patrick moved through the house with the ease of a man who had lived alone for a long time and was discovering, with genuine and daily surprise, how much better it was to live with Henrietta. She had her opinions about where things should be kept, and they were not always his opinions, and they negotiated these things with the same directness they applied to everything else, and the negotiations were consistently more interesting than he had anticipated. She continued her document work from Elias Prout's back corner, which expanded as her reputation in the county grew. People came from neighboring properties to have contracts written, disputes documented, letters composed. She discovered she had a particular gift for the kind of letters that needed to say difficult things in ways that could be legally understood and humanly tolerated, and she wrote several land dispute letters in the winter of 1878 and 1879 that settled matters without requiring the involvement of the county court. She also continued her involvement with the Town Improvements Committee, where she and Mrs. Hargrove had developed a working relationship that was entirely based on mutual respect and entirely free of personal warmth, which both of them found perfectly adequate. Together, they pushed through the road maintenance budget revision, a new well on the east side of Main Street, and a petition to the territorial government about the school, because there was no school in Caldwell and the Becker children and the other children of the surrounding farms deserved one. The school petition was the one that mattered most to Henrietta, and she worked on it with the concentration that she brought to things that touched on what her mother had believed, and she sent it to the territorial legislature in February of 1879, and she waited. In March the answer came. The territory would fund a portion of a schoolhouse. The community would need to provide the land and the construction. Patrick organized the community effort, and Henrietta organized the fundraising, and by May there was a schoolhouse, small, wood-framed, with 4 windows and 12 desks, made by a carpenter named Hanson, who charged them half price because his 3 daughters would be the first to sit in those desks, and a teacher who came from Wichita and boarded with the widow of the old rancher Doc Carver had buried. On the day the schoolhouse opened, Henrietta stood on the step and watched the Becker children walk in, the 4-year-old now a few months older and considerably more opinionated than he had been on the floor of the kitchen, and she felt a fullness that was specifically the feeling of something her mother would have been proud of. Patrick stood beside her and put his hand in hers, and she leaned slightly into him without thinking about it, the way you lean into something solid when you trust it completely. Their son was born in the late autumn of 1879, the second week of November, when the Kansas prairie had gone the color of old copper, and the wind had its first genuine winter edge. He came into the world with considerable volume and the dark hair of the Finley side of things, and Patrick held him in the first hour with the expression of a man encountering something he did not have adequate language for, which was a rare condition for him, and which Henrietta found entirely worth witnessing. They named him James, for Patrick's father. James Edward Hadley, the Edward being for Thomas Finley's suggestion, which he made in a letter that arrived 6 days after the birth, because he was 43 miles away and had been informed by a writer Patrick sent the same evening. Thomas wrote, "I am very glad he exists. I am also very glad he is named for someone other than me, since Finley men have not always been noted for their wise decisions, though I am working on this. Please tell Henny I will be there before the snow is too deep." He arrived 10 days later, covered in trail dust and carrying a carved wooden horse he had made himself during the long evenings on his homestead, for the baby who could not yet appreciate it but who, Thomas said, would when the time came. He sat with the baby on his knee and looked at him for a long time with the quiet wonder of an uncle encountering his first nephew, and said, "He looks like you, Henny." "He does not," she said. "He has your jaw," Thomas said. Patrick, who had been watching from the kitchen doorway, said, with complete neutrality, "I also think he has her jaw." "You are both wrong," Henrietta said, "and he is beautiful regardless." They were, demonstrably, both right, and the boy's jaw was one of the first things anyone ever mentioned about James Edward Hadley when he was growing up. That, and the combination of his mother's directness and his father's steadiness, which appeared in him so early that by the time he was 3, he was already the kind of child who looked at the world squarely and said what he thought of it. December brought the deep cold of a Kansas winter. The house was warm because Patrick had lined the walls against the weather and maintained the wood supply with the same systematic attention he brought to everything he was responsible for. Thomas stayed through Christmas, and they had Christmas dinner with Doc Carver and Gus Melville and the Beckers who rode in from their farm, and the schoolhouse teacher Miss Ellis, who would otherwise have been alone, and Mrs. Hargrove, who showed up unannounced and was entirely integrated into the event before anyone had decided whether to invite her. The table in the Hadley house was not large enough for all of them, and they added 2 borrowed tables and several mismatched chairs, and it was crowded and loud and warm, and smelled of roasted meat and pine from the small tree Henrietta had put in the corner for James, who at 6 weeks old was not aware of the tree, but who was passed from person to person around the table like a very small prince receiving his court. sleeping through most of it with the complete serenity of a baby who has decided the world is a satisfactory place. Gus Melville held him longest, which surprised everyone, and did so with a competence that suggested experience. And when someone asked about it, he said, "I have 6 brothers and 2 sisters, and I was the oldest," and then changed the subject. After Thomas went back to his homestead in January, after the new year turned, after the deep winter settled over the county, and the work of daily life continued in the reduced, interior way of cold months, Henrietta and Patrick had the house to themselves again, and their lives took on the rhythm of 2 people who have figured out how to be close. She wrote and organized at the kitchen table. He handled the county's work from his office, and came home at the end of the day to eat dinner she had made, which she had become a competent cook from necessity rather than inclination. And she listened to what the county had brought him that day, and he listened to what she had worked through, and the conversation was real, not the performance of domestic conversation, but the actual sharing of a day's work between 2 people who found each other's work genuinely interesting. He was a good father. She had known he would be, because he was careful with things that mattered, and James was the thing that mattered most to him after she did, and sometimes before she did, in the way that newborns will demand priority, which she did not find threatening but rather right. She watched him in the early mornings when James woke before the dawn, Patrick getting up in the dark with a patience that surprised her given how deeply he slept, walking the baby quiet in the kitchen while she lay in the bed, and listened to his footsteps, and his low voice speaking to their son in the particular, unself-conscious way a person talks to a very small child when they think no one is listening. She lay in the bed and listened and felt, in those moments, something that had no precise name but was the closest thing to complete she had ever felt. Spring came back to the prairie with the theatrical relief of something long awaited. The garden she had planned went in the ground in April. She had expanded it considerably from her winter notes, adding a kitchen garden along the south wall and a cutting garden near the front walk, because she had decided the house needed color visible from the street, and this was a practical method of providing it. She planted while James sat in a wooden cradle Patrick had made during the February evenings, watching the sky with the focused interest of a baby discovering that the world has depth. Thomas visited in the spring and stood at the edge of the garden watching her work and said, "You are gardening, Henny." "I am aware of that," she said, without stopping. "You used to say gardening was the thing you were least likely to do," he said. "I also used to say I was least likely to stay in one town," she said. "People change." "You have not changed," he said, with the affection of a brother who has known her all his life. "You have just," he thought about it. "You have just found out more about what you are." She looked up from the soil. He was grinning at her with the complete, uncomplicated happiness of a younger sibling who has gotten away with something. "Your homestead," she said. "How is it?" "It is good," he said. "The spring grass is coming in well. I am thinking about cattle." He hesitated. "I have also met someone." She stood up. "Tell me." "Her name is Ruth Caldecott," he said, and then, seeing her expression, added quickly, "Not that Caldecott. Her family came from the East. She is teaching school in the town near my property. She is very sensible and very kind." "And," Henrietta said, "and I like her very much," he said. "I wanted to tell you." She looked at him for a moment. Then she pulled off her gardening gloves and crossed the garden and hugged him, which was the second time she had done it in his adult life, and he held on just as he had at the fork in the road and said, "Is that approval?" "That is approval," she said. "You are going to bring her to meet us." "I was hoping you would say that," he said. The summer of 1880 was warm and full. James was walking by July, unsteadily but determinedly, and he had his mother's jaw and his father's patience, and everyone who met him remarked on one or the other, depending on whether they had met the parents in a professional or personal context. Patrick was re-elected county sheriff in August by a margin that suggested the county had developed a strong opinion about keeping him, which Henrietta had predicted. Thomas brought Ruth Caldecott to Caldwell in September. She was a small, composed woman of 24 with light brown hair and the direct gaze of someone who reads a great deal. And when she and Henrietta met for the first time, they looked at each other with the mutual assessment of two people who understand that the other person is worth assessing carefully. And then they both smiled at the same moment, and the conversation that followed was the kind that goes on longer than anyone intends. Ruth and Thomas were married the following spring, on the property, in a simple ceremony that Henrietta attended with James on her hip and Patrick at her side, and she stood in the spring grass of her brother's land and watched him make his vows to a woman who was going to love him carefully and well. And she thought of her mother and her father, who had not lived to see this, and she let herself feel the particular grief of good things witnessed without the people who should have been there. And then she let the grief be what it was, real but not consuming, carried alongside the happiness rather than instead of it. James took several independent steps during the ceremony and fell down dramatically on the last one, and was entirely unperturbed by this, and stood back up and tried again, which was the most accurate thing that could have been said about the Hadley-Finley approach to most things. Patrick watched his son stand back up and looked sideways at Henrietta, and caught her eye, and the smile that passed between them across the ceremony was quiet and deep and entirely their own. They drove back to Caldwell that evening in the wagon with James asleep between them, his head in Henrietta's lap, his feet against Patrick's leg, and the prairie evening was long and blue, and the first stars were coming out over the flat horizon when Henrietta said, "I want to tell you something." "Tell me," Patrick said. She looked down at James, sleeping with the absolute trust of children in the people who carry them. "When I rode into this town," she said, "with the bullet hole in my sleeve and the horse that was not mine, that I remember," he said. "I thought I was riding in for 3 days," she said. "Long enough to find Thomas and determine the problem and do whatever needed to be done, and then I would go." She paused. "I did not know what going would mean. I did not have a destination. I had not had a destination in quite a long time." "Where did you think you would go?" he asked. "I did not let myself think about it," she said. "Because thinking about it too clearly would have meant admitting that I did not know, and not knowing where you are going is something I find considerably harder to tolerate than most things." He was quiet for a moment. The wagon moved on the road. The prairie evening deepened. "And now," he said. She looked at him. The last light was on his face, the particular amber of the western sky in late spring. He was looking at the road, and his hands were easy on the reins, and he was the most familiar thing she knew, which was also the most remarkable thing about him, that a man she had known for 2 years felt like the most familiar thing in her known world. "Now I know exactly where I am," she said, "and I know where I am going." He reached over James's sleeping form and took her free hand, and drove the wagon one-handed while he held it, and neither of them spoke again for a long time, but the silence was so comfortable and so complete that it was its own kind of conversation. James woke up as they came into Caldwell's Main Street and looked at the lit windows of the saloon and the general store and the evening activity of the town with the focused curiosity of a nearly 2-year-old encountering the familiar world from the novel position of having just woken up in it, and said with great seriousness, "Home." "Home," Patrick confirmed. "Home," Henrietta agreed. They put James to bed with the efficiency of parents who have learned that the window between sleeping in the wagon and sleeping in the cot is narrow and requires speed. And then they stood in the kitchen in the quiet of the house after the child was settled, and Patrick made coffee, because he was the one who always made the coffee, and she sat at the table that had her notary log and her committee notes and her garden plans, and she thought about all of it. This kitchen, this table, this man. This town, with the specific and grounded gratitude of someone who knows what they have because they know what it cost. By 1882, Caldwell had a school with 23 students, a second general store, a newspaper run by a young man from Ohio who had come west with a printing press and considerable opinions, and a reputation in the territory as a county that took its law seriously, which was Patrick Hadley's work, built over years of the hard, unglamorous effort of someone who believed in the thing he was doing. The Ladies Temperance Society had, through the gradual diplomacy of daily life, stopped describing Henrietta as too fierce for polite company. Mrs. Hargrove had been heard at a committee meeting referring to her as Mrs. Hadley, whose practical knowledge of land law is considerable, which was a more significant reversal than most people realized. And Henrietta had, at some point, stopped thinking about whether she was too fierce for polite company, because she had never been interested in polite company in the first place, and Patrick had told her from nearly the beginning that he had never wanted it either. Their second child was born in the spring of 1882. A boy again, which James received with the resigned tolerance of someone who had been promised, by nobody in particular, a younger sister, and the resigned tolerance faded by the second week when the baby, whose name was William Thomas Hadley, the Thomas for her brother, whose name deserved to be carried forward, developed the habit of watching James with an intensity that James found flattering, and that persisted into every year of their lives together. Patrick held William the same way he had held James, with the speechless expression of someone who keeps being surprised by the same miracle, and Henrietta watched him and thought, again, that watching him with their children was among the most valuable things she had access to. Thomas and Ruth came for the birth and stayed a week, and Ruth held William with the practiced ease of a woman who was, as Thomas announced with considerable pride, going to be a mother herself in the autumn, and Henrietta took her sister-in-law's hands in hers and said, "Good. James needs cousins who can argue with him." "Your James argues," Thomas said with mock astonishment. "He absolutely does not get it from my side," Patrick said, also with complete neutrality, and Henrietta looked at both of them and shook her head with the expression of a woman surrounded by people she loves who are being deeply unreasonable. In the spring of 1883, the town of Caldwell put a sign on the schoolhouse with a plaque that read, "School established by community petition, 1879." In smaller letters beneath it, because the committee had debated the wording and settled on this, "For the children of the territory and for those who believed they deserved one." Henrietta saw it for the first time on the day it went up, standing on the street with William on her hip and James beside her holding her other hand, with the confidence of a boy who has always known the world is friendly to him. She read the plaque without speaking. Patrick stood behind her, and she felt his hand at the small of her back, the weight of it certain and familiar. She thought of her mother at the kitchen table in the farmhouse outside Abilene, teaching her to read, teaching her to do accounts, saying, "This is the thing that cannot be taken from you." She thought of the long, uncertain years after the farm and her father gone into the January dark and her mother following. She thought of the horse she had ridden into Caldwell on with a bullet hole in her sleeve, not knowing what she was riding toward. She was so glad, she thought, that she had not known, because if she had known she would have ridden faster and the speed would have been the wrong way to arrive. James tugged her hand. "Mama," he said, "can we go to the store? Mr. Prout got the licorice in." "He got the licorice in," she said. "Papa told me," James said, with the satisfaction of a child who has sources. She looked at Patrick over her shoulder. He had the expression of someone who is pretending to be innocent, which on his face was transparently unconvincing. "Did you tell him about the licorice?" she said. "I mentioned it," Patrick said. "You mentioned it," she repeated. "In passing," he said. She looked at her children, James, 5 years old and already her jaw and his father's patience, tugging at her hand with the urgency of licorice-related need. William, a year old on her hip, watching his brother with that concentrated attention that had already become his signature way of being in the world. She looked at Patrick, who was watching her with the warm, unguarded expression that he had stopped trying to contain sometime in the first year of their marriage, having apparently decided that containing it was not worth the effort. She thought, "Here is the thing, here is the whole thing." "Fine," she said to James. We will go to the store." They walked down the main street of Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1883, the four of them, in the warm morning that smelled of new grass and the approaching season. And the town moved around them. Gus Melville sweeping the saloon step, calling a greeting. Mrs. Hargrove coming out of the church with her committee papers, nodding briskly. Doc Carver's assistant, a new young man who had come from St. Louis, talking to a patient outside the office. The newspaper boy delivering the Ohio man's opinions about the cattle industry to anyone who had a cent. This was the town they lived in. This was the thing they had made, not by themselves and not without cost, but made nonetheless. That night, after the boys were asleep, James, with the absolute unconscious abandon of a healthy child, William curled on his side with one hand under his cheek, in the particular way he had from the beginning. Henrietta sat on the front porch of the house on the eastern edge of town and looked out at the prairie in the dark. The same stars that had been over them the first night Patrick had told her he had never wanted polite company. He had wanted her. He came out and sat beside her, bringing 2 cups of coffee because he always brought 2, and she took hers and wrapped her hands around it and leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they sat looking at the dark land and the thick stars and the distant silver line of the creek. "I want to tell you something," he said. "You told me something the first time we sat like this," she said. "I know," he said. "This is a different something." She turned her head to look at him. His face in the starlight was the same face she had looked at across a saloon table 3 years ago with the assessment she brought to everything. But what she saw in it now had more layers and more depth and more history, and was, for all of that, more not less. "Tell me," she said. "Every day," he said simply. "Every single day since you rode into this town, I have been glad you rode in. That is all. I just wanted to say it clearly, where I am not trying to build a case or solve a problem or say it elegantly. Every day, I am glad." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she set her coffee cup down on the porch rail and turned fully to face him and put her hands on either side of his face, the way you hold something you want to see clearly. "Every day," she said. "I am glad too." He kissed her in the dark on the porch of the house that was theirs, in the town that had called her too fierce for polite company and had gotten her anyway. And the prairie night was all around them, enormous and quiet and full of stars. And inside the house their son slept the sleep of children who are safe. And somewhere 43 miles west Thomas Finley was sleeping on the land he had fought for and built and kept. And somewhere in a small house near the school Miss Ellis was already planning the next term. And August Becker's children were growing up on their land, on the land that was rightfully theirs, on the land they had kept. Henrietta Finley, Henrietta Hadley pressed her forehead against her husband's and breathed the night air of the Kansas prairie and knew, with the complete and undefended certainty of someone who has found the thing that was always meant to be found, that this was where she had been riding toward all along. Not because it was quiet or easy or what anyone had planned, but because it was real and it was hers, and it held everyone she loved inside it like a lamp holds a flame necessary and warm and entirely worth protecting. The prairie went on in every direction. The stars were brilliant and indifferent and beautiful. The night smelled of spring and coffee and home. It was enough. It was everything. It was exactly enough.